Welcome to ICERM's first public lecture of the 2016-17 year. I am Brendan Hassett, Director of ICERM and Professor of Mathematics at Brown University. ICERM is the Institute for Computational Experimental Research in Mathematics. We are a research institute at Brown, supported primarily through grants from the National Science Foundation. ICERM does not have its own faculty. We host short and long-term topical programs across the mathematical sciences, bringing researchers from all around the world to collaborate on problems of common interest. We focus on mathematical problems inspired by computation, patterns arising from computer-aided experiments, and challenges in mathematics amenable to computational exploration in data, as well as applications of these technologies to practical problems. Our passion is to bring young people into the mathematical sciences by exposing them to computational questions of broad interest. Thus, we are grateful to have Barbara Simons here for our first public lecture of the year. So, Dr. Simons is a distinguished computer scientist. After receiving her doctorate at Berkeley, she worked at IBM Research for many years. She has published important work on algorithms for scheduling, clock synchronization, and fault-tolerant network routing. Her research led to a number of patents. Dr. Simons has served as president of the Association for Computing Machinery, the main professional organization for computer scientists, and she's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She received the Distinguished Alumni Award from the College of Engineering at UC Berkeley. And she's done many other things that I'm not going to list here. So in recent years, she's focused on security and reliability of computer-based voting systems. She has served on a number of expert committees advising the government on elections. Since 2008, she's been on the Board of Advisors for the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, an independent, nonpartisan commission established by the 2002 Help America Vote Act, which was passed in the aftermath of the 2000 election. No more hanging chads. She chairs the board of Verified Voting, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that advocates for legislation and regulation promoting transparency, accuracy, and verifiability of elections. In 2002, she and Douglas Jones published a book, Broken Ballots: Will Your Vote Count?, addressing the complex technology now used to count our votes. So please join me in welcome Dr. Simons. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Can you hear me okay? For that very nice introduction. One slight change. The book was published in 2012. In 2002, we didn't know much about what was going on yet. So I have to say, people have told me how timely this talk is, and it's a lot more timely than I wish it was. I really wish that I could just be telling you this stuff and it didn't have such practical application. So there are three topics I want to talk about today: electronic voting machines, internet voting, and voting registration databases. And these are all relevant to the upcoming election. So I'm sure that everybody here knows this, but I show this slide because there are some people who actually make purchases of voting systems who don't appreciate that computers are not perfect. And we all know that voting software, well, we don't all know, but voting software, a little bit counterintuitive, tends to be a very, very large programs. Initially, you would think that voting software would be relatively short because you just have to record the vote and count it. How difficult can that be? The problem is that these voting machines are they're like general purpose computers. They're supposed to run anywhere. And states have all kinds of different laws. So there could be ballot rotation laws. There can be the top name on the ticket is from the same party as the governor. There could be vote 3 out of 5. There are all kinds of regulations that vary not only from state to state, but within states. As a result, you can have very large amounts of software for these voting machines, which makes it hard to debug them. And the idea that with large software, with large systems, you are going to have bugs, again, I think for non-computer people is not intuitive. And so what I'll typically say to them is, think about Apple and Microsoft sending out constant bug fixes. If they could write perfect software to begin with, they wouldn't do that, right? And a lot of these fixes tend to be security vulnerabilities. So Apple and Microsoft, is that this? Apple and Microsoft have a whole slew of They're a lot bigger than the voting machine companies, and they have a lot more resources. So you can imagine what it's like for voting machine companies. And software bugs or malware in the software can impact election results. So as a result of the 2002 law that was just referenced, computers are used almost everywhere. Is this a problem? There are two different kinds of systems used in voting in polling locations. One is called direct recording electronic, that you directly record your vote on the machine. And then the machine records your vote and counts it. As you can imagine, the problem with these machines is if they break down, there can be long lines, right? Because you have to vote on the machine. They tend to have touch screens, and initially, most of them were paperless. As a result of complaints led mainly by computer scientists, some of them have been retrofitted, and they're terribly engineered. They have continuous thermal printed rolls, which can be hard to read. The fonts can be hard to read. They're hard to recount. They fade if they're not properly stored. And at least one of the major vendors would record every single thing that the voter did and did not have a summary. So it was very hard to verify that your vote was properly recorded, and that was the whole purpose of the paper. There are also paper ballots. They're similar to like when you take an SAT and you fill in the oval, or in California, what we do is you have two ends of a ballot, and you connect the broken line between the ballot for the candidate of your choice. Those ballots are then fed into scanners, a scanner, which records and tabulates the vote. Again, there's a computer inside the scanner. Then there's remote voting. Mail-in ballots. So those of you who do absentee voting, you'll do it on a paper ballot. They get sent to the election official, and that gets fed through a scanner, again, in a central location. The disadvantage of mail-in votes, and I have a lot of problems with them, actually, but a major disadvantage is if you make a mistake, you don't get another choice. Whereas if you fill out a ballot in the polling place, for example, if the machine thinks you voted more than once, it'll spit out your ballot, and then you can get a new ballot. But when you mail it in, you don't get that. And then there's, of course, internet voting. It can be either email or web-based, and that's the most insecure form of voting, and we'll talk more about that. So I'd like to start with electronic voting machines, and I'm sure those of you in the back of the room probably can't read this, so I'll read it for you. This is Dilbert. We won a contract for writing software for voting machines. And then Dilbert asks, who do you want to be president? Why do you ask? Because I want you to be happy. You're implying that you plan to fudge the system. I am not implying anything like that. Obviously, it will be easy to fudge the data, and we are far happier when you're in a good mood, but I would never commit a crime just because it is good for me and totally undetectable. Okay, good. So, who do you want to win, and by how much? So, how did we get to where we are today? As was mentioned, well, Florida 2000 sort of started this with the hanging chads. But it took Florida 2002, which is the midterm, where they also had problems, to get the Help America Vote Act passed. That was passed. Almost $4 billion was made available to modernize our election system, get rid of the hanging chads, and ultimately get rid of the lever machines in New York, although that was quite a while later. Election officials were pressured to update their equipment because this is the newest and the greatest. They wanted to show they were ahead of everybody else. They were going to get these great machines. They had free money, so there was a rush to get machines. However, there were no standards. There was inadequate testing. There was secret software, proprietary software, so independent experts couldn't look at it. There was and is no accountability of vendors for flaws in the software and hardware. These machines are now failing in large numbers. They're old. Many of them have ancient software developed in the 1990s or early 2000s. And I've got a bunch of security people sitting here, and I'm sure that they know what that means. You don't know anybody, I'm sure, who has a computer that dates back from those days. But we vote on machines that have computers that date back from those days. In 2012, there were long lines, and the major cause of those long lines was the failure of these DREs, direct recording electronic machines. So you've probably all heard of Diebold. Most people have. Diebold became the poster child for all that's wrong with these machines. They got themselves to that position because there was software posted on an open FTP website that was downloaded by somebody who wasn't even a computer person. She just happened to be poking around and found it. She passed it on to a computer security team. They looked at this software, and they found that it was horrible. Independent of that, we know that in 2002, Diebold machines were used in the Georgia midterm election. I think it was the first time they were used. There were last-minute software patches being written almost just before the election occurred, with no oversight. They're actually written by a guy in Canada who was, sending them down to somebody in Georgia. Now, anyone who's worked on a large software program knows that you're frantically writing last-minute fixes before the product goes out the door, or at least before it gets frozen. In this case, it was before the product went out the door because people were literally voting on the machines almost immediately after the software was added. Again, no oversight. In that election, Senator Max Cleland lost, although he had been ahead in the polls. The Democratic governor, whose name escapes me, also lost, although he had been ahead in the polls. We do not know if any of those last-minute fixes impacted the results of those races. Nobody who is independent has looked at them, and of course, at this point, the software no longer exists, so there's no way to go back and find out. Also, Diebold made the press, and I think this was the main reason why it had such notoriety, because the president of Diebold Voting Machines Company was quoted in a letter to supporters of President Bush, saying that he was going to help Ohio deliver the electoral votes to the president next year. And some people felt that this was not a good sign. I have to say, if he were going to rig the election, why would he say so in a letter? But maybe he didn't think people would read the letter who might be suspicious. Who knows? It was not a wise move on his part, but it certainly added to suspicions that people had. And as I say, multiple studies, not only that initial one from the software that was obtained on the open website, but subsequent studies, one of which I'll refer to later on, has shown that these machines have multiple security problems. Oh, by the way, please ask questions during the talk if you have any questions. I guess there are mics. Anyway, is that okay? They can ask questions during the talk? Okay. You can go to YouTube and view a video showing how to rig these Diebold machines. It was made by Ed Felton, who's now working at in the White House. He's a Princeton professor on leave, working at OSTP. He and his students made a video back in 2006 showing how you can basically rig these machines using the removable memory card and infect the machines like a virus, as the way viruses get infected is being passed from one to another. Again, it's impossible to detect or protect against because there's nothing to recount. And just to remind you, these machines were used in over 10% of voters, by over 10% of voters in 2006, these Diebold machines. Diebold got out of the voting machine business. They had a lot of bad press. But the machines that they manufactured, some of them are still being used today. All of Georgia, which seems to be in play, will be voting on Diebold paperless DREs, the same kind that we know how to rig if you go to the YouTube video. Now, Diebold, of course, has gotten a really bad rap, maybe deservedly so, but they're not unique. In 2007, California Secretary of State Deborah Bowen, who actually ran on this, she created what she called a top-to-bottom review of all of the voting machines in Houston, California, different kinds of machines. Diebold was one of the machines that was looked at, but was not the only one. And here's a quote from Matt Blaze. Security people might know who he is. He said, "We found significant, deep-rooted security weaknesses in all three vendors' software." By the way, there were not and still are not very many vendors, because this is not a big market. You think about who buys these machines. Election officials buy the machines, and there's only so many places that buy them. So there are three major vendors back then. It should now be clear that the red team are the good guys who try to break into the machines, were successful, not because they somehow cheated, but rather because the built-in security mechanisms they were up against simply don't work properly. There was a pervasive lack of good security engineering across all three systems. And again, to remind you, many of these machines are still in use today and will be voted on in November. Now here's an interesting example of contrast between paperless and paper. In Carteret County, North Carolina, I believe this was 2004, almost 4,500 votes were lost. We know they were lost. This is a paperless machine. We know they were lost because this machine was used for early voting. And either somebody didn't adjust a counter or didn't know what the limit was. At some point, it stopped recording votes in the memory. But if there were error messages, nobody relevant saw them, so people kept on voting. But their votes went into a black hole. And we know how many people's votes were not counted because we know how many people went to the polls to do early voting, and we know how many votes were counted. In fact, we know the people whose votes weren't counted because it was done, I guess, you could see who went when. Unfortunately, one of the statewide races for agricultural commissioner, the difference between the number 1 and number 2 person was less than the 4,500 votes. So there were a variety of attempts made to deal with this. First, they were suggesting that, well, just the people in Carteret County should vote just for this race, and that was thrown up by the courts. I mean, you think about it. How do you rerun an election? Do you just let the people who didn't get to vote vote? What about the other people who didn't get to the polls? Shouldn't they be allowed to vote? I mean, you can see there are all kinds of issues that come up. So they had various proposals for what to do. They all got thrown up by the courts. Finally, the candidate who was ahead in the polls collected affidavits from people who had gone to vote and had their votes not counted, who said they all voted for him. Based on those affidavits, he went to the judge and said, look, I won. And the judge said, okay, you're the winner. So that, as far as I know, is the only election that was decided by affidavit. By contrast, in Pottawatomie County, Iowa, in the Republican primary, the initial outcomes were very suspicious. I think a high school kid was leading, and everybody knew who the winner was going to be, but he didn't win. They actually had to go to court to get permission to conduct a recount. They had paper ballots, but there was no provision for doing a recount. But they went to court, got permission, did the recount, and discovered that, in fact, the candidate who everybody thought should win had won. The problem was that there was a ballot rotation that was going on, and whoever programmed the computer, you basically have to tell the voting machine, a mark in this spot is for this candidate, a mark in this spot is for that candidate. If you get it wrong, you might get the right numbers, but they'll be assigned to the wrong people. And that's what happened here. So the votes were all rotated, so everything shifted, and they got the right people because they were able to do a manual count. But if that had been a paperless system, they would have been stuck with the results they had. So again, I said it's not just Diebold. In Virginia in 2014, people were going to vote in the midterm, and the Win Vote, which was the machine being used there, was behaving oddly. It turned out that people had their iPhones, they were listening to music or something, and the iPhones were interfering with the voting machine. Why were they interfering? Because the voting machine had Wi-Fi. They had a Wi-Fi. So when this all happened, this was after the election, the election official from Virginia brought in Virginia security people. They looked at these machines, and within 5 minutes, they were able to break in. They found with the wireless connection, there was unchanged encryption key, ABCDE. They could download the database, change votes, and upload new votes. They used Windows CE 3.0, no security updates since 2007 with the password admin. The system was decertified by Virginia, but before this happened, it had been used by 568 precincts since the early 2000s. We don't know how many, as Jeremy Epstein said, who's a computer security expert living in Virginia who's been fighting these machines for years, if nobody rigged an election using these machines, it's only because they didn't try. After the long lines in 2012, President Obama appointed a commission which was co-chaired by the two attorneys from the two presidential campaigns. So his attorney and Mitt Romney's attorney co-chaired. So it was bipartisan. And the idea was to create a response to the 2012 long lines. So the commission came out with a really good report. They referred to the impending crisis in voting technology. That's a quote. And they also said the machines are now reaching the end of their natural life cycle, and no comparable federal funds are in the pipeline to replace them. They further said that audits of voting equipment must be conducted after each election, and data concerning machine performance must be publicly disclosed. They also recommended risk-limiting audits, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I just want to observe that if you're going to do these recounts and audits, you need paper. At this point, we don't know any other way to do it. I mean, and I know there are a bunch of crypto people here, and there are some crypto systems that we could talk about later, but for this, as far as the systems that are now available for commercial use, that's all we have. Now, California in 1965 passed this interesting law that requires 1% manual recount of all precincts. So 1%, you randomly select 1% of all the precincts, and you manually recount them. Law was passed in 1965. It was way ahead of its time, but there are things it didn't address. So it didn't say, what do you do if you find problems? In fact, it didn't even say what a problem is. And it didn't talk about how do you escalate if you do find problems, which of course weren't defined. So that was sort of the state of things until fairly recently. What I've been advocating for, and my colleagues, Verified Voting and elsewhere, are evidence-based elections. You want to be able to verify that the computer-declared winners actually won. And as I said, at this point, the only way we know how to do that is to sample paper ballots that are already verified by the voters. Now, risk-limiting audits were developed by Philip Stark, who at the time was chairman of the statistics department at UC Berkeley. He's now an associate dean there. He's the first statistician, and he's the first statistician who sat down and looked at this problem and said, how should this be done? What is a problem? How do we escalate? How do we start off? And so on. And basically, there are two variables that are relevant. One is, how much certainty do you want to have that the computer-declared winners were in fact the winners? And the second is, how close is the race? So if the race is very close, you're going to have to look at a lot more ballots because a small number of ballots could flip the results. Whereas if it's far apart, you don't have to look at very many. Also, obviously, the more certainty you want to have about the winners, the more ballots you have to look at. So these are the two variables. You plug them in, you come out with a number that you start with. And then a problem is, there's sort of two kinds of problems. One problem is, if I vote for candidate A, and it shows that I voted for candidate B. That's two, right? Because A, B. Whereas if I vote for candidate A and it doesn't record my vote at all, that's one. Make sense? So 1, 2. It's sort of relevant today to like people who are Bernie supporters who want to vote for a third-party candidate. That's another way of looking at it. So again, Philip came up with these with risk-limiting audits. And in general, in California, where we have this 1% law, there was another law passed that allowed people to experiment with risk-limiting audits instead of the 1%. And by and large, people end up having to look at far fewer ballots because most races aren't that close. And it's, statistics, it's a great thing to use. Most election officials don't know statistics, and they feel a little intimidated by it. But again, Philip gets his hands dirty there, and you can come up with approximations. He has variations on the theme of how to do this. And this is really what we should be doing. The nice thing about risk-limiting audits, properly done, is it provides evidence for the losers and the loser supporters if they've truly lost. Or you do a full recount, right? I mean, you will find out who the winners are. So the commission came up with this great report, which was widely ignored. It seems to happen a lot in this area. For 2016, for November, there will be 5 states where everybody in those states will be voting on paperless machines, paperless DREs. Those are Delaware, Georgia, Louisiana, New Jersey, and South Carolina. And as I said earlier, Georgia may be in play. In addition, there are 10 states where some of the people will be voting on paperless machines, including Arkansas, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and to a limited extent, Florida. In Florida, it's only for accessible machines for voters with disabilities. So it's a smaller number in Florida than in some states. Pennsylvania is a pretty significant number of voters who will be voting on paperless DREs. Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Florida are all swing states. It will be impossible to conduct a meaningful recount in those states, especially the first 2. As I say, Florida is going to be a much smaller number. Even where there are paper ballots, most states don't have requirements of post-election ballot audits. Some do, some don't. Some have requirements that are kind of funky, like Florida has some really weird ones. Others have very good ones. It's all over the map. So just having paper ballots doesn't mean that there are going to be audits. It's great to have paper ballots, but if you never look at them, you might as well be paperless. In the short run, and by the short run I mean these are recommendations that we were making for this upcoming election, most of which I think have been ignored. What you really want to do is to provide emergency paper ballots for all locations, polling places that use DREs, whether or not they have a paper trail, because as I said earlier, you have to vote on the machine. If the machine breaks down, and they will, you can have long lines, and that will disenfranchise voters. We know that they broke down a lot in 2012, where they're still being used. I mean, Maryland, fortunately, no longer has DREs, but a lot of other states still have them. Where they're still being used, they're likely to break down more because they're 4 years older. Election officials are actually having to cannibalize machines to keep others running because a lot of these machines aren't being made anymore. The other recommendation is to conduct post-election ballot audits wherever you can do that, wherever there are papers. In the long run, and by the long run, I hope not the very long run, we should be replacing all DREs with paper ballots. And typically the systems will have I mean, there are a few places like in New Hampshire where they do manual recounts of everything. Manual counts, not recounts, manual counts. But in most places, and especially places like California, which have humongous ballots, there are going to be scanners which will record and count the votes. And so when you have those, you also have to have post-election ballot audits. We basically have moved computers into our voting systems, and we haven't changed our laws to reflect the use of computers. We had badly engineered computers, initially badly engineered systems. We didn't use the computers properly, and we didn't have the laws. I mean, when I first started working on this, a bunch of us computer scientists were accused of being Luddites by election officials, which we thought was rather amusing given that, I mean, I live on my computer. We actually probably know more about computers than they do, but it was a rather hostile thing. Now, election officials, most of them realize that they've got to replace their systems because they're failing. They're failing. And one other final comment. It really, truly should not be the responsibility of a candidate or candidate's supporters to have a recount or an audit. If we really want our democracy to work properly, we should want to make sure that the correct candidates are selected, the people who truly won. And that burden should not fall on the shoulders of any candidate. That's just not fair, in my opinion. And it doesn't help our democracy. It should be independent of the candidates. So this is a summary slide. We should have evidence-based elections where it's possible to convince the losers and the loser supporters that they've truly lost. In order to do that, we need voting systems, well-engineered voting systems that can be audited and recounted, and laws that mandate risk-limiting post-election ballot audits. And I'll just add parenthetically, there's some interesting work going on open source systems. I mean, I didn't mention open source here, but open source, basically, instead of having proprietary software that nobody can look at, you have software which people can examine without anybody who wants to. It's not open source in the traditional sense where people can't go and change it, but it's really public source. And there's a very interesting project going on in Los Angeles County, which is the largest voting entity, I think, in the country. Travis County, Texas, which is Austin. There's also a couple of non-for-profit companies that are working on this. So we may, in a few years, have some good systems. They have computer security people working on this. They have auditing people working on this. They have people who know about accessible technology for voters with disabilities, usability experts. So this is what should have been done initially. So we should have some good systems available, but at this point they're not. They are not yet ready for production. And I should also add that all these systems have to go through a form of certification. So I'll be delighted if they're ready by 2020, if they're in use. And the good thing is, there's not a lot of money, but these systems will be a lot cheaper than the original systems because of the way they're being developed. So that's it with machines, internet voting. What do these places all have in common? They've all been hacked, right? I mean, I could have put a lot more on this slide. This is just a small piece. So I think that first slide should just do it, but I've got a lot more. Stating the obvious, how can underfunded, understaffed, under-resourced local election officials, most of whom have little to no computer proficiency or computer security expertise, and no access to computer security expertise, protect their systems in an internet election from well-financed adversaries, foreign powers, political operatives, and rogue hackers? As I said, this talk seems to be more timely than I would have liked because there's all this talk about foreign country hackers. When I first wrote the slide, that wasn't the case. I mean, it may have been happening, but we didn't know it. Internet voting regulations, there are none. There are no independent standards or testing, no government oversight, no legal accountability or ability to recount or verify election results. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, was asked to develop standards. They produced reports, but no standards, they don't want to produce standards. And here's why. They said technology that is widely deployed today is not able to mitigate many of the threats to casting ballots via the web, and malware on voters' personal computers pose a serious threat that could compromise the secrecy or integrity of voters' ballots. However, they are being pressured. They are being pressured to produce standards because there are internet voting vendors, and they want standards because they want to be able to say they satisfy them. One of the things that makes voting a difficult problem altogether is the secret ballot. So if you buy a book from Amazon, you want Amazon to know you're buying the book, and you want to know what Amazon is doing. You want this two-way communication. If you're voting, that's not what you want. You want to have a secret ballot. Having a secret ballot just makes a much, much harder problem than e-commerce. Furthermore, online voting, it's tricky to do online voting and maintain the secrecy of the ballot, because if you think about it, when you have online communication, at the server end, they have to know who you are. Now, again, there are encryption techniques for dealing with this, but they are not being used by any of the commercially available vendors, and of course, these things can get quite complicated. So, all of the commercially available vendors do not do this. Basically, when internet voting is being used by a number of people in the military overseas, and when they do that, they have to sign a waiver saying they are knowingly giving up their right to a secret ballot. Now, I personally think nobody should ever be asked to give up the right to a secret ballot. I don't care if they want to or not. It's an issue of democracy because of the whole coercion and vote buying problems. I mean, it should not be your right to give up your right to, I mean, obviously if you vote remotely, you can show someone your ballot, but the idea of encouraging people to sign waivers saying they'll give up their right, I just think is a bad idea. Now, a lot of very well-meaning people, well, actually, I was in this group too, believe that internet voting will increase voter participation. This is a standard assumption. It's not correct. Internet voting has been used by a lot of small municipalities in Ontario for many years. There's data that people have been able to look at. What they have seen is that voter participation does not increase with the internet. If it increases at all, it's infinitesimal amount. And participation by young people does not increase. What happens is that you have the same pattern of voting over the internet that you have in polling places. The same age groups are represented in roughly the same proportion. So it does not increase participation. It does not increase participation by young people. In fact, young people are the least popular, but of course they don't vote much anyway. It's an issue. Some of you may have heard of Estonia's system. I mean, Estonia is held up as an example of a country which has been doing internet voting successfully for years. And in fact, they're pushing their product. They're trying to sell it to neighboring countries. I had the interesting experience of being invited to Estonia some years back by the Centre Party, which is the second largest party in Estonia. They invited me there because they wanted me to say that the internet portion of their elections was being rigged. People in Estonia can vote either over the internet or in person at polling place. and they wanted me to say it's being rigged. Well, of course I couldn't say that. I had no way of knowing. The reason they believe it's being rigged is that if you look at the results that they get on the internet portion of the election, they do much worse than they do on the paper ballot portion. But there could be perfectly legitimate reasons for this. Maybe their voters don't trust the internet and don't vote over the internet so much. There's no way to know. So, I just couldn't say what they wanted me to say. However, there was a 2014 study done by independent outside experts that demonstrated significant security problems with the system. And basically, in summary of the Estonian situation, even if the study hadn't occurred, I think it's a very unhealthy thing for a democracy if leaders of the second largest party routinely think that the elections are being stolen. It's not a good thing. The DC hack is one of my favorite stories about this. This happened just before the 2010 midterm election. Washington, DC was going to allow overseas voters to cast their ballots over the internet. And they had a system that was written for them. But before they went live with it, they did something which is unique, unfortunately. They opened it up to anybody to try to test. Now, if you think about it, if you believe that a system is insecure, an internet voting system, and you want to try to hack it, you can't do that during an election. I mean, that's a felony. You're not going to do that. The only way you can try to do it is if something like this is done, where you're given the opportunity, because it's not a real election, it was a fake election. They were using the exact same software. So they were doing what they would have done in a real election, but it was a fake election. So several of us voted in the election. I voted in the election. And it was kind of interesting because after I cast my ballot, this really cool song started to play. And it was the University of Michigan fight song. This test was done 2 weeks before they were going to start voting on this system. Within 36 hours of starting the test, a team from the University of Michigan had complete control. They could change already cast and future ballots. They could reveal the voter's secret ballot, and of course, they could install their calling card, which was the fight song. And again, sorry for those of you in the back. You should sit in the front next time. This is an example of one of their ballots. And if you look at it, you'll see that they were all write-ins. And they chose sci-fi names like HAL 9000, Skynet, Johnny. I don't know all these names myself. I don't recognize all of them, but hopefully some people here do. Anyway, this is an example of what the University of Michigan team did. It clearly shows that they had control. Since the beginning of the test, as I say, they had also had total control over the network. They could have stolen votes in a real election. The default master password, this is for the network, was unchanged from what it was in the manual. So they basically just looked at the manual for the system, found the password, and that worked. Now, you say, well, how can anybody do this? The fact is, a lot of people do it. This is not uncommon. And in fact, the election officials in DC are not stupid. I mean, it's not like they're particularly bad. It's just that they made mistakes. This is one of the mistakes they made. The security cameras also didn't have passwords, so they were able to look at the security cameras and watch operators typing in their passwords and watch them configure and test the equipment. In addition, they observed probes coming from China and Iran. Now, obviously, China and Iran were not trying to break into a fake election. There are always probes on the system, going around the net. I mention this only because it illustrates the fact that there are these threats ongoing, and in real elections, they might not be so harmless. Okay, another concern, another issue, is phishing. So phishing attacks can steal voters' credentials for voting and other nefarious purposes. So basically, these are fake websites or emails. This is what, according to BuzzFeed, this is what got the DNC. So there were fake emails sent to people at the DNC claiming to be from Google and saying that there were problems with the login. They had to go and change their passwords. So they clicked on, so some people, not everybody, but some people clicked on the link, went to the website, put in their passwords. So their passwords were obtained and their machines were infected with malware. And it was designed by a Russian hacker known as Fancy Bear. Here's an example of a phishing website. Again, sorry guys in the back. This is Bank of America, and I've never gotten something like this, but anyway, this looks pretty legit. It's not, of course. And in fact, banks never do this. They never tell you to click on a link because of security issues. But people have done it. I mean, people have done it with phishing. So we often hear the comment, I can bank online, why can't I vote online? And my response is, you can't bank online. Banks lose millions and millions of dollars every year from online theft, and they replace it quietly. So I actually bank online, because I know if there's a problem, they'll replace it. And it's obviously, at this point, still cheaper than building new buildings and hiring new tellers. But they keep quiet about it because they don't want to scare people off. As I said earlier, the secret ballot makes voting much harder problem than e-commerce. And you can replace stolen money, but you can't replace stolen votes. The Zeus virus is a really cool virus. I'm sure that the security people here have all heard of Zeus. It can steal money from your online bank account. It does steal money from online bank accounts. But it's very clever. So when the victim looks at the online statement, it looks right, even though the money's already been stolen. You find out eventually because, a check will bounce or something else unpleasant will happen, and that's how you find out. There's also versions of Zeus available for mobile phones. And what's particularly pertinent to this talk is that there are customized versions available on the black market. I'm not an expert on this stuff, but it seems to me that it would be a lot easier to just have a piece of software that simply changes someone's vote, either based on a political party or a name, than to mess with their bank account statements, which is more complicated. So you could have a customized version written that would change people's votes. You don't have to be a programmer at all. Just get to the right place. One of the arguments that's been used for internet voting is that it's necessary so that overseas military voters can get their ballots back in time. And that has been a problem in the past. So in 2009, Congress passed the MOVE Act. The MOVE Act says that every state must make available to overseas voters, military and civilian, blank copies of the ballots online at least 45 days in advance. The idea is that you then download the blank copy, fill it out, mail it in. If you're military overseas, the government will pay for expedited return of the mailed-in ballot. It seems to me that this comes pretty close to solving the problem. Obviously, there will be some people who won't get their ballots in on time. Oh, and by the way, something else that some states have done is they've extended the period during which they'll accept the ballots so long as they're postmarked by Election Day. That's another way you can approach this problem. I don't think it's doing our military voters and our overseas civilian voters any favor to encourage them to use an insecure system for returning their voted ballots, especially because we have a relatively secure, making blank ballots available, you can also imagine there could be issues with that, with messing with the blank ballots, with using phishing and so on. So it's not completely a secure thing to do, but it's a lot more secure than sending voted ballots back over the internet. I actually was up in Vancouver a couple weeks ago, talking before a committee of parliamentarians there about internet voting, and I think this is what got them. I asked them, what will you do if you allow internet voting at the federal election level, and you discover 6 months later that an election had been hacked. 6 months after a government has been seated. And this is not a far-fetched notion. The Yahoo breach started in 2014. The DNC breach had occurred at least 6 months before it was discovered. It's a common thing when breaches are discovered that they're discovered some months after they were at the initial penetration. In the US, 31 states plus the District of Columbia allow some form of internet voting, mainly for military and overseas civilians. In California, for example, I think it's only the return of faxes, but faxes can go over the internet, so we consider that internet voting. In other states, it's much more really, a number of states allow voters to return their ballots as email attachments. And I've actually had the experience of having election, and others have too, of having an election official say, we don't do internet voting, we just use email. And, I don't know where they think email comes from. Anyway, anyone in Alaska can also vote over the internet. This is the only state that allows anyone to vote over the internet. When was it, 4 years ago? The Democratic candidate who lost, it was quite close actually, but he lost, was trying to get information about how many people had voted over the internet. He wanted to get the results and details about how this was done, not how individuals had voted, but how many had and so on. And he had a very hard time getting it. Even just being able to find out what happened at times can be difficult. Since the DC hack, no vendor has allowed that kind of test to be done in the United States or elsewhere. It's being used in other countries too. No vendor has allowed it. And I think there was one case where I think Edmonton, Canada, had a jelly bean contest. They were letting people to vote over the internet, allowing people to vote over the internet, and were letting people to try to hack it, but only people who lived in Edmonton, which is not very realistic if you think about it, because with the internet, anyone from anywhere can attack it. Living in Edmonton is a pretty narrowing form. And they wouldn't let anyone else try. We asked, can some folks from the US try to break in? No. Mm-mm. So that's it for internet voting. My last topic is voter registration databases, which is something that's relatively recently on the scene, although they've been around for a while. Again, we have Florida to thank for this. Democrats believe that voters in Florida 2000 were wrongly removed from the voter registration databases. Republicans believed that voters who shouldn't have been voting that their names were added to the voter registration databases. So they both distrusted the database that they were using. I'm sorry, just the voter registration, excuse me. It wasn't really a database, just the registration. They got together and they said, okay, we've got a problem. How are we going to fix it? Well, let's bring in computers. So they brought in computers, and there's a requirement that every state should have a statewide database of registered voters. By 2006, well, that didn't happen. A number of states didn't meet that deadline. In fact, I think California finally has one. I'm not quite sure of the status in California. Again, this law was passed with no testing, no tracking, no vendor accountability, no federal standards, including security, and of course, again, the software could be proprietary. Pattern. In Washington State, a candidate for the Secretary of State office, who I think used to work at Microsoft, uncovered a backdoor in the state voter registration database. She was not doing a massive security check. I don't know how she found it, but she found this backdoor. It would have allowed a hacker to modify the database and could change the voters' addresses or pad the voting rolls. Now, this is particularly disturbing for a state like Washington because it's all vote by mail. So if you can get in there and mess with their database, their voter registration database, you can screw things up really well. People won't get their ballots. I mean, eventually they'll know they didn't get their ballots, so it'll come out, but meanwhile, a lot of people will probably be disenfranchised. And there'll be chaos. We don't know how many other voter registration databases may have undetected vulnerabilities, but we do know the Arizona and Illinois databases have been hacked. Again, the FBI claims by foreign hackers. And I just read today that the Illinois, I'm sorry, was it Indiana? Pence is Indiana, right? So in Indiana, I just read this today, in Indiana, there have been a number of changes, not authorized changes, to names in the voter registration database. We also know that probes have targeted election systems in over 20 states. Again, a probe is not necessarily a hack, but if you're going to try to hack into something, you might want to sort of check around first to see what you might be able to do. The Department of Homeland Security has offered to help states detect vulnerabilities in their systems. By now, 33 states have accepted that offer. I think it's a good thing that DHS is doing. However, it's very late. They probably don't have the resources to do really good checks, especially between now and Election Day. And in fact, people are already voting. So, it's a good thing to do, but it won't solve the problem. I still don't know why the other states haven't accepted it. It's a mystery to me. So why should we worry? Voter registration databases contain party affiliation, and an attacker could selectively disenfranchise voters. And again, as I said in the case of Washington State, if it's done on a large scale, it'll create chaos. And this kind of thing will be uncovered eventually, as opposed to internet voting where you may never find out if it was rigged, or paperless voting machines where you may never find out if it was rigged. Here you'll find out, but the damage can still be done. And these systems are really vulnerable right now, I think. Because we've seen lots of databases, like the Yahoo database was hacked, 500 million. And who knows we don't know what different states are doing. As I say, there's no decent oversight. If a voter had been registered and that person's name is stripped off the rolls or the address is changed so the voter goes to the wrong location, the voter should be given a provisional ballot. I mean, that's the law now. That was part of HAVA. Different states count provisional ballots differently, but generally speaking, if you get a provisional ballot, you have to prove that you are a legitimate voter. This could be a problem if they can't find a database that has your name on it. So we need for election officials to be backing up databases frequently, at least daily, if not more frequently, not right over other backups. And we don't know, as I say, it was just discovered in Indiana that some addresses had been changed. We don't know what changes may have occurred in different places already. So frequent backups, voters should be encouraged to check that they are all registered. There should be paper copies of the voter registration databases provided at every polling place, and there should be a lot of provisional ballots provided in case that there is a problem. In the long run, we need regulations developed by database and security experts. The people who pass these laws tend to be I think in many cases they really are well-meaning. They just don't understand the technology, and they don't consult the right people when they're writing the laws. They may not even realize they should consult the right people when they're writing the laws. They don't even know who the right people are to consult. An example of best practices that should be followed is there should be no mass deletions or insertions shortly before an election. And we need to have a master copy that has no internet connection. Now, that's an easy thing to say, but how do you implement it? Especially when you have to have changes made to the databases as new people register, old people move away or die. So this is a non-trivial problem. So if people are looking for problems to work on, here's a good one. In general, we need to replace all DREs, we need to change laws, we need to stop the march to insecure internet voting, we need to make voter registration databases as secure as possible, and we need to provide funding for our elections. We just don't spend enough money on elections right now. And if our democracy really matters, we need to be prepared to spend more money. Finally, I just want to give a plug for verified voting. There's a lot of information on our website, and I guess maybe I'll give a plug for the book. So this is a book, the 2012 book that Doug Jones and I wrote, if anyone's interested, Broken Ballots, it's called. So that's it.
Thank you very much. I think Dr. Simons can take a few questions. We would very much like to have questions, but if you're going to ask a question, please go to one of the microphones. So there are microphones in the aisles, and then we can all hear your questions. So the question is, how many different things would you have to hack to influence the election? How many jurisdictions or political entities?
Yeah, the question was how many independent modules are there that you would have to hack. One of the concerns about the introduction of computers into voting is that it changes the magnitude of things. ES&S is the largest, the most voting machines are ES&S machines. They have, I think, a majority of machines in the country right now. I'm not positive about that, but they have a lot. You don't have to go and change each individual one if you have access to the master code. And with computers, you can do wholesale changes, as opposed, for example, to old-fashioned paper ballots, manually counted paper ballots. We know that there was fraud done with that in the past, but it has to be, it's more of a retail kind of thing. People have to be on the ground to do it. You have more people probably involved in the conspiracy. With software, as I was giving that example of the Georgia in 2002, one programmer was making changes to the software that was going to be used for the entire state of Georgia. One programmer. You can have that kind of situation. So computers make the threats larger.
Well, you may have now partially answered the question I was going to ask, but I wondered if you could compare the vulnerabilities of the old lever machines with modern computers. And I guess the general question is, are we going backwards or are we going forwards here?
I voted on lever machines when I lived in New York, and I never thought anything of it. Well, I never thought anything about most of this stuff until, a decade ago. The old lever machines were also insecure. You could rig the old lever machines. One way of doing it is to break off one of the teeth from the levers. Another way is to stick a piece of lead in there to prevent one of the levers from going around. There were various tricks that were done. But all of those tricks required somebody to actually go there and do it. Well, I guess if the tooth broke off by accident, that would change the results too, but that's not intentional. So that was more of a retail kind of thing. Let's say when you bring computers in, it becomes more wholesale.
Hi. I guess a follow-up to the first question in terms of the scale of what would need to be done. I mean, if you were Russia or another foreign power, and you were looking to, change the results of the election somehow, and you had a large dedicated team of professionals being paid by an intelligence agency for years, thinking about it and planning about it, how big a task is this? I mean, I would think it would make a big difference. It would be easier if it were a closer election, harder if it's less close, that kind of thing. But, are you talking about something where the risk is obvious and imminent? I mean, the DNC hacks were pretty clear. I mean, we know what's going on in terms of that activity. We don't know what's going on in terms of that. I wonder if you have a sense of the scale of how difficult that is.
Well, I don't know. One of the things, as I say, these databases really worry me because they've sort of gone under the radar. I co-chaired a study in 2006 that was done by ACM looking at voter registration databases. We had a list of 99 recommendations, just like it wasn't at the same levels as the Presidential Commission, but just like the Presidential Commission's report, it was widely ignored. People haven't been paying attention to these databases. We know that databases have been hacked, a lot of them. So I think that's one major source of vulnerability as far as the voting machines go. They could have had a mole in working for one of the vendors making software changes. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to make people totally paranoid. What I want to do is get the problem fixed.
I guess the way to think about it is if you were in charge of trying to change the results of the election in the United States in 2016, how many hackers, how much money, how long would you ask for? If you're going to the budget director and you're saying, this is my covert operation program, what do I need?
Well, I'm not really an expert in hacking elections, but
I think you are. More than me.
I agree with your earlier comment that basically to rephrase your earlier comment, the closer the election is, the fewer changes you have to make. The more likely that one candidate is going to walk away with the election, the more you have to rig it. So, I mean, I'm hoping that it won't be a close election. I mean, that's something that election officials always say. Please, God, don't make it a close election. This is not a partisan statement. They don't want the issues, the kinds of issues that we have to worry about. As to what I would do, I mean, remember also, it's not just the presidential election, it's the down-ticket ballots you have to worry about. The down-ticket candidates. So again, I think databases are highly vulnerable. I mean, if I were concerned, for example, about the makeup of the Senate, I might, in some state where it's close, go to databases of people where there's a large representation of people. We know certain areas tend to have more members of one party, certain areas tend to have more members of the other party, right? I mean, San Francisco's going to be Democratic. You know, out in the country, in California, it's more Republican. We know these kinds of things happen. So you could target databases for areas where your opponent is likely to do well and screw things up. That would be one way. But I'm sure there are lots of good ways.
Hopefully a slightly more hopeful question, a little bit less depressing, or terrifying. If you were in charge of designing a system, say an optical scan voting system, and you wanted it to be something that could be used outside of the US, so it had to be able to deal with people, for example, in Ireland ranking candidates or in Australia ranking candidates, would you, or in Maine possibly after this election, do you foresee any way of doing that in a way that was still accessible the way electronic machines are, but without resorting to going back to paper ballots and only paper ballots?
So if I can try to interpret your question, tell me if I've got it right. You're saying what happens if you have, instead of first past the post type of voting, you have something like instant runoff voting or some other form of ranked choice voting? How would you deal with that? Is that your question?
Yeah, how would you be sure that your scanner was doing a good job of counting something that's more difficult than just a bubble?
Right. It's harder. And it's really hard. I mean, I don't know, instant runoff voting in particular, for those of you who don't know what it is, the idea is that you rank your candidates. In San Francisco, we only do a top 3. So you vote for your first choice, your second choice, and your third choice. And then if nobody has a majority, if it's say, a single position, you take the candidate that has the least number of votes and you redistribute their number 2s. And you keep on doing that until somebody gets a majority of the number of ballots that are still outstanding. It's very complicated. And I don't like it. The reason I don't like it is that you almost certainly need a computer to count it, and it's hard to check the computer. There was an election in British Columbia a few years ago where they were asking exactly this: do you want to have instant runoff voting? And it lost. And I think one of the reasons it lost was that in British Columbia, they actually manually, at least for provincial elections, manually tabulate the ballots, which is very easy to do because typically they have a single ballot and there are 5 choices, 1 candidate from each of the political parties, and that's it. They don't even have write-ins. If you want to do a write-in, you have to go somewhere else. And those are manually counted at the end of the night in the polling place, and they reconcile everything. Nobody can leave until everything matches. It's very easy. With instant runoff voting, it's not so easy. There are other forms of ranked choice voting that are easier to do than instant runoff voting, like, I mean, I don't want to get into a long discussion of these things, but there are easier forms that I think could be amenable to checking. Instant runoff voting may also be amenable to checking, but it's a lot more complicated. So I just prefer trying to keep things simpler. If you want to do runoffs, why not do runoffs? I mean, instead of having instant runoff voting, have a runoff. Anyway, that's only my opinion, and you may very well differ with what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Should we go back and forth?
Hi. So yeah, I'm Secretary of State here in Rhode Island, and this has been of a lot of concern to me, as you can imagine. We've got a lot of questions in the office, and as I think about these issues, I think about sort of where government is with regards to security and the professionals that we have in our systems. And I happen to be very fortunate and feel very strongly about the IT team that I have. But this is all really very new. And I'm curious as to what are the conversations across the country about building the capacity of IT professionals within the sector of within governmental sectors to be able to handle this new way of looking at election systems. That, to me, that's actually one of the challenges. Is it that we're going to now require, because I asked about this, what kind of certifications should we be asking for our staff to get? And this is like the Wild West. There's nothing really standardized yet. It's not like attorneys getting continuing legal credits. So I'm just curious as to that conversation around capacity building of governmental programmers. And
I don't know anything about that, but I hope a lot's going on because we desperately need people who are knowledgeable and sophisticated about security. And of course, one of the problems is that when these machines were developed, they weren't developed by people with that kind of expertise. And by the way, I mean, I know this is these kinds of when I give this talk, I get everyone depressed. The best way to be disenfranchised, is not to vote. So, I mean, it's really hard. How do you go about telling people we've got these serious problems, but don't not vote. Please don't not vote. You should go vote. And after the election, we should work together and fix these problems. Because if we don't talk about the problems now, people will ignore it after the election.
I echo that, for sure. If anybody has any questions about Rhode Island, we have our IT director here, as well as myself. We'll handle all of them. Be a voter.
Yes, please vote.
Since we're at ICERM, I have to ask, is there a mathematical way we could verify the results of the system? Exit polling, some standard test, some type of sampling that would identify, gee, it looks like we have a problem over here or over there.
I'm not an expert on exit polling, but I've been told that it's not entirely reliable by people who I trust. I mean, even one of the problems is, I mean, we saw in the 2000 election with the butterfly ballots, when a lot of people voted for Pat Buchanan, a lot of Jews voted for Pat Buchanan, and even Pat Buchanan said they didn't mean to vote for me. But there was no way to redo that. We could know there was a problem, but we don't have the legal wherewithal to redo an election or to tweak an election where some mistake was made. We don't have that. So that's something else to think about. How do we, I mean, I don't know if there's any legal experts here, but I mean, there are a lot of interesting legal questions related to the use of technology in our elections. And in fact, even that were there before, but weren't uncovered before we started looking at these issues. I'm not sure if I answered your question, though.
So legislation is obviously a huge problem and will dictate what has to be done and what can't be done, what has to be done, and so forth. Do you see any other country that has good legislation in terms of requiring audits of the software, requiring the software to be open source, requiring audits of the votes or paper ballots, whatever, afterwards? Coming from Brazil, I know that that's a particularly bad example. They claim to have the biggest electronic election in the world, and indeed you have 100 million people voting on the same exact type of DRE with no paper trail. So, you know, this could make us all a little less depressed here. But they're trying to change that. But in any case, do you see any country that's doing better in terms of, and could be in terms of inspiration in terms of legislation in any of these aspects?
Well, I agree about Brazil. There's a mathematician who was there during one of the elections, and he claims at one point he was watching the screen and he started to see numbers going backwards, which he thought was a bad sign.
There's no evidence, and you can't prove whether there was any problem or not. So
I know.
That's big problem.
I think that's just a terrible situation for any democracy. I mean, I like what happened. So I liked what I saw in Canada with these hand-counted paper ballots, but it was a very simple ballot. I mean, I think one of the problems that we have in the United States is that our ballots are too damn complicated, and coming from California, I can attest to that. We have so many I mean, this coming ballot's going to be crazy. I don't see how in the United States, and I'm not answering your question, but I don't see how in the United States we can get away from the use of computers as long as we insist on having lots of things to vote on each ballot. We're just not going to get away from them, so we have to use the technology properly. In terms of other countries, as I say, other countries tend not to have such complicated ballots. In a parliamentary system, you just vote for your member of parliament, and that's what they have in Canada, that's what they have in other countries. It's relatively simple. We're not, I'm sure, going to switch to a parliamentary system in the United States. So that's not in the cards. So, you know, I think we just have to make the best, we have to make what we have work. And in order to do that, we have to use technology and the laws appropriately. That's what we have to do.
So just 3 more questions.
So there are a couple solutions like that, like John Kitcat has been looking at since 2004 about either blockchain accountability or visual crypto. And it's like punch scan is where you're able to take, you get a cryptographic hash and then you're able to throw it out and verify it, you know, through many parties, like over the course of several days before it even begins to get counted. And along with that, you also have the visual crypto that you can essentially print out along with that hash, lay them on top of each other, and that's your vote. You know, that's the bottom line verification. Could that be integrated in any safe way, or do you think that's
Well, I think
inherently insecure?
that there are a lot of promising uses for crypto in polling place voting, like punch scan. There is, you may know of Benedita's work with Helios, which is an internet voting system that uses crypto. Ben is for those of you who don't know who Ben is, he's a former student of Ron Rivest. Ben has stated publicly on multiple occasions that his system should not be used for any kind of major governmental election because he just doesn't think it's secure enough. So I think that that crypto, as I say, I think it has a lot of promise for polling place voting. None of the systems that are currently in use today, commercially, is using crypto. There's a lot of research going on it. You referred to a system, other people are working on it. So I think they're promising approaches, and I hope they work. But something else to keep in mind is that whatever system we move to has to make sense to the average voter, not to the average cryptographer. And there is a difference. So, you know, if it seems too complicated, that could be a disincentive. No, there are ways of using crypto that don't seem too complicated. So, you know, I'm not saying it's an impossible problem. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, no, that reasonable. Thank you.
You mentioned several times that you thought we needed paper ballots and manual recounts or manual counting at the end, at least to sample like California does and so forth. But what about having every voter put their ballot in twice into 2 different computers, and then you've got an automatic verification right there with 2 different counts?
So, well, I mean.
So they stick it in, they pull it out, they put it in, and it's gone.
Well, how do you know that the software in the 2 computers aren't in collusion?
Well, that's, of course, one of the problems you have, but you always have that, right? So.
Well, I mean, you also need, I mean, there are other things I didn't talk about. Obviously, transparency is a big issue. You want to make sure that when the audits are done, that they're done in a very transparent way.
Yes.
Again, in Canada, they had something they called scrutineers who came to the election. They had badges. And when I was actually a poll worker at one of these elections, and when we were counting the ballots, the scrutineer was standing behind me, looking over my shoulder, watching me count. In most places in the United States, you can't do that. You can't get up close like that, but that's what they were doing. And of course, the results were posted on a website. Not on a website. They were posted in a local polling place. We need transparency. We need good chain of custody of the ballots to make sure that something funny doesn't happen to the ballots between the polling place and where they are counted and other times. So there are lots of issues that I didn't touch on, but they're not directly related to technology. In terms of your suggestion of having 2 different computers that count the ballots, I mean, if what you're saying is there are paper ballots that you put in 2 different computers, I have no problem with that. But if you're just saying
paper ballots, and you
Yeah,
can count
that's
them
fine.
afterwards if you need to.
That's fine.
But this now
That's fine.
might cut down by more than half the number of times you have to do a manual recount.
Well, I don't know what the analysis would be for that. I mean, you know, if you want to, you basically, I think Philip would want to sit down and think about,
Of course.
yeah. But again, you know, that's going to be more expensive.
You double the cost of the computers, but you said they need more money anyway for everything they're going to do.
Well, we need more money, but
Lots more.
we need, you know, I'm always in favor of giving computer people more work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here this evening and delivering this wonderful talk. Thinking about the practical nature of moving forward, you know, maybe beyond this election to the next elections, listening to your talk, I get the impression that efforts have been made really at the last second prior to each of the elections. So we should really get on it now for the 2020 election.
Yes.
Given the advances in encryption, end-to-end encryption, we heard a wonderful talk earlier this week about multi-point encryption technologies, and the relative ease of configuration of various VPN, you know, virtual private networking technologies. Is it feasible, in your opinion, that we can, you know, approach something like installing SSL VPN, for example, which is web browser based for each of the polling centers or the voting centers, to deliver all results encrypted, safely to to where the votes would be counted. It's completely transparent to the voter because it's point to point and they're not involved in that process. You know, you mentioned that one of the big risks that we saw was that the systems were easily hacked. With the advancements we've seen in encryption and VPN technology, that should answer that question. Do you think that's feasible given the scope of the many polling centers around the country?
Let me see if I understand your question. So you're suggesting, are you suggesting just uploading the results, or are you suggesting voting? I don't quite understand.
I'm suggesting that we encrypt the connection between the polling center and to where the votes would be delivered. Irrespective of the voters, it would not involve them.
Right, but they would vote on paper ballots to begin with?
They would vote at their voting centers in whatever method. But the systems that they're voting on, they would be communicating across the VPN.
Well, I mean, transmitting the results from a polling center to election officials electronically using encryption, that's an easy problem. I agree, that could be done, but that doesn't deal with many of the other issues that we talked about. But I mean, I agree with you. That's
Right, so
something
the accessibility to the machines.
well, I mean, if you're talking about voting on a DRE, paperless DRE, and then transmitting the problem is the paperless DRE could have a problem.
All right.
The election official server could have a problem after everything is decrypted, if it's hacked. So you're sort of like not solving the problems at both ends. You're taking care of the problem in the middle, which is actually the easier problem, easiest part.
Okay, I'm going to allow one more question,
Okay.
and then we'll stop.
I'd like to second that. Thank you very much for being here and talking to us. I think I appreciate everything you said, and I didn't really understand how in-depth the threat was until we had this chat, so thank you. I think one of the challenges is, it sort of has to do with the way that voters verify that they were able to vote for who they meant to vote for. And if there was a way to receive a receipt and then cross-check that, receipt later down the road and see that the input that they requested at time of voting correlates maybe 2 weeks down the road after the results have been tallied, that might sort of assist in the verification aspect, because people would know, whether or not, the person they voted for is who they voted for. So I don't know if that's something that's being discussed, or I'm sure it is.
Yeah. So people who are working on using encryption for like polling place voting, there is this notion of getting a receipt. It should be encrypted, and it should not be possible, this is one of the things that makes it hard, for you to show someone else your receipt and be able to prove that you voted for a particular candidate. Because one of the issues with receipts, if it's like in plain text, you could sell your vote. That's why when people go to the polls to vote, you do not get a receipt. You might get something saying, I voted, but you don't get something saying how you voted. And it's because it would be easy, The idea is to discourage coercion and vote selling. Again, with encryption, there are systems where people do get receipts, they are encrypted, and because they're encrypted and because of encryption magic, you can't prove it to somebody else how you voted, but you can still verify. So yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.